The film Selma has only been out a few weeks, but already it is wrapped up in controversy. Controversy about its portrayal of LBJ, about Oscar snubs, perceived Oscar snubs of like the director, but also about who should get to see it, especially when we're talking about the young. And so you've got a very different situation depending on what part of the country you're in. Now, for some students, there's a program called Selma for Students. It was started in New York City. 27 business leaders funded 27,000 free tickets for 7th through 9th grade students in that city, and the effort expanded from there. Now, 275,000 free tickets will be made available with different requirements depending on which state you're in for middle and high school students. They can show their ID and they can get in free to see that movie. Which
it's outrageous. It's a redistribution of wealth.
Exactly. They should have to pay that $15 for the tickets. Now they don't have to. As I said, the age range for the free tickets varies depending on the city, and movie theaters will only be able to provide a certain number of tickets based on how many have already been paid for. DeKalb County School Superintendent Hugh Taylor, on the other hand, canceled a school outing.
I read the whole
Hugh Taylor, yeah. He canceled a planned outing by students at the predominantly minority school, saying he was concerned about obscene language and racial profanity in the Oscar-nominated film. So there was a history class that wanted to take a trip to see Selma, since it shows an important part of American history. And he's saying, no, they use potty language and I won't allow it. So in some places, they're trying to make sure that kids know they learn the lessons of the civil rights movement. In others, balaked. Can't go.
I don't know. Maybe Hugh Taylor is a progressive black guy who wants to protect kids from language. But either
it's possible.
Whatever he is, it's a terribly stupid, short-sighted decision.
Yeah.
You, Hugh Taylor, are just like Mr. Carson on Downton Abbey. Take that.
That's timely.
Yeah.
No, I haven't seen Selma yet. The language and the violence in it, how excessive is it?
There's more violence in 93% of all movies. Yeah, I mean, there's more violence in 100 movies that came out in 2014. I mean, this violence you feel because these are real people, and they did go through that violence, and and a pastor from Boston is murdered, and but that's what the story is about. I mean, if the argument against violence is that it's got to be contextual and relevant to the story, there's literally never been a movie where the violence was more relevant and in context.
Perhaps it has to be fictional.
Yeah, there's not.
Which is why American Sniper's okay, since he lied about so many of those kills.
I mean, I like to point out that Expendables 17 came out this year. Right? It's not so like.
Another great movie, also snubbed at the Oscars.
So weird. So let's talk a little bit about that Oscar snub, not for the movie. It was nominated
for Best Picture.
For Best Picture,
and there was a Best Actor.
No, David Oyelowo was not nominated.
Oh, he wasn't.
No.
Oh, I thought he was.
Now,
Okay, another snub.
There were a snub, but look, the 5 men who were nominated were great, and I think he was terrific. I don't actually have a problem with that one. I mean, I think that if you count Jake Gyllenhaal in Nightcrawler, who was really great, like those with 5 who were nominated, Oyelowo and Gyllenhaal, there were 7 great performances, and 5 of them are going to get nominated, and 2 of them aren't. That's just the way it's going to go.
Okay.
But the director wasn't nominated. Anna DuVernay wasn't nominated. She'd have been the first black woman ever directed. It just feels like an oversight that wouldn't have happened if it had been directed by, if David Fincher had directed this film. It seems like it would have been directed.
And I watched the What the Flick review of it. She's one of the few working black female directors in Hollywood right now, at least.
Yeah.
And so it would have been a good move, especially considering it was well directed. I assume.
It's really well paced, and you feel the tension again about a story where you sort of know how it turns out. And what's weird about it is just the numbers game. You could nominate up to 10 movies. 8 were nominated. Selma was one of the 8. There are only 5 directors nominated, so obviously, if there were 8 movies nominated and 5 directors, 3 directors aren't going to get nominated. But Bennett Miller was nominated for Foxcatcher. But Foxcatcher wasn't nominated for Best Picture. That just, and now granted, the process is different. The full Academy votes on the Best Picture. Only the director's wing votes for Best Director. But that's a statistical anomaly that shouldn't be. Like if you were nominated for Best Director and there are enough movies to get extra movies nominated for Best Picture, your movie should be nominated for Best Picture. So that's the switch. And Bennett Miller did a nice job with Foxcatcher, but she belongs there. But what was interesting from a political point of view is what we think cost, what some people think, and I think it rings true to me, cost Anna DuVernay that nomination, was that right before the voting came in, there was a movement to suggest that the portrayal of LBJ, played really effectively in the movie by Tom Wilkinson, was unfair. And it was not
historically inaccurate.
It was historically inaccurate. There is no doubt about that. But of course, that happens in almost every movie. And LBJ, since they made him a principal character in the movie rather than some sort of generic government figure, represented the establishment opposition to what's happening. And so they had LBJ represent
Other people.
a whole,
amalgamation.
a whole wing of opposition that they had to face. So let me read a couple of quotes here that should give you an idea of just why everybody should ignore this. LBJ's fine, right? His legacy is
he's not
protected, right? He's not fine.
He died.
But I mean, this is the guy who passed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act prior to that. You cannot diminish those great accomplishments. Bill Moyers was his press secretary at the time. Here's what Bill Moyers had to say. There are some beautiful and poignant moments in the film that take us closer to the truth than anything I've seen in other movies to date. The cruelty visited upon black people every day by whites and armed authorities, the humiliation they face simply trying to register to vote, name all the county judges in Alabama. That's a line delivered to Oprah Winfrey in order to get her registration card.
Name one.
Right, name one. The courage and fear of those black people to put themselves on the line for freedom's sake. The ambivalence of Martin Luther King as he faced the inescapability of leadership and constant threat of death. I cannot imagine the dread one had to subdue to step on that bridge that day. And I came out of the theater, says Moyer, shaking my head in disbelief at the obscenity of the Republican Party, and that's today, as it has piously but insidiously taken up voter suppression as a priority. The party of Lincoln, of emancipation, Nixon's Southern strategy, Moyers continues, of 50 years ago has now become the subliminal mantra, whites of America unite. Back in the 1970s, in the early days of a resurging conservative movement, the late Paul Weyrich, I talked about him earlier in the show, godfather of the religious right, co-founder of the American Conservative Union and of ALEC, declared, and then this is a quote from Weyrich that Moyers cites, "I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of the country. They are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down."
And they're going down.
And it's going down. So that's Bill Moyers coming out and saying, hey, look, man, the film's great. And he has an interest in protecting LBJ. So then he goes on and he talks about the LBJ thing. We'll do it quickly. As for how the film portrays LBJ, there's one egregious and outrageous portrayal that is the worst kind of creative license because it suggests the very opposite of the truth in this case, that the president was behind J. Edgar Hoover's sending of the sex tape to Coretta King. Some of our most scrupulous historians have denounced that one. He's right. And that part's not really necessary to deny someone a Best Director Oscar because it's silly. It doesn't matter. And again, from a storytelling point of view, it was important that they established that the most powerful people in the country were trying to get Martin Luther King.
And rather than introduce a new character to do that, they throw it in a character you've already seen.
I got it. But that said, if people think that LBJ was behind that, and then finally he says, then casting the president as opposed to the Selma March, which the film does, is an exaggeration and misleading. So he's not going out and saying, again, that it's this grave injustice. It's like he wasn't opposed to the march, but we talked at the beginning of the show, our first story about politics and about playing politics. And the president suggesting now a revamped tax bill that will that would again mostly lower capital gains. That's where most of the money will come from. And the right is saying he's
raise capital gains.
Raise capital gains. Right, exactly. Raise the rate so we get more money into the treasury. And the right is saying that is hideous and he's playing politics. But that's what LBJ. And the truth is, of course, what LBJ and MLK, what they debated, what the conversation showed. I'm going to paraphrase it very simply, is that LBJ wanted political will to have. He said, I need.
Yeah.
He recognized, a great politician, LBJ, that politics were going to make a difference in passing the Voting Rights Act. You couldn't just go support it. You had to get the votes to make it happen. And he needed the votes. So his hesitation with King was like, let me get to a moment where I know I can get him. And King was like, no. And so LBJ was like, all right, so you're going to do this march. He said, well, then let's make this march the thing. So they were two guys working for the same thing with the same goal in mind. Anyway, I just thought it was worthy to bring that stuff up because I feel like she's getting a bad rap, Anna DuVernay. And very quickly, because he wrote this thing this week or over the weekend in the Los Angeles Times, John Lewis, who was there, who's portrayed in the movie, congressman from Georgia. He wrote an op-ed in the LA Times, and he had this to say, and this should be, everybody who hasn't seen Selma should be left with this. The movie Selma is a work of art, says Lewis. It conveys the inner significance of the ongoing struggle for human dignity in America, a cornerstone of our identity as a nation. It breaks through our too often bored and uninformed perception of our history. And it confronts us with real human drama our nation struggled to face 50 years ago. Continuing with the rest of what John Lewis said. Selma does more than bring history to life. It enlightens our understanding of our lives today. It proves the efficacy of nonviolent action and civic engagement, especially when government seems unresponsive. With poignant grace, it demonstrates that Occupy, inconvenient protests, and die-ins that disturb our daily routine reflect the legacy of resistance that led many to struggle and die for justice, not just centuries ago, but in our lifetimes. It reminds us that the day could be approaching when that price will be required again. I just love that he brought up Occupy, that he brought in everything that's happening now. This is a guy who made the country better, continues to serve in Congress from Georgia. And a reminder that this isn't over and that these things going on that you were talking about earlier when you were quoting Dr. King about the moderate whites.
Yeah.
This stuff makes them uncomfortable. Occupy made them uncomfortable. The die-ins made them uncomfortable. Yeah. And he's saying, no, this is what you're supposed to do. We're supposed to make people uncomfortable. That's how we make progress.